So, in early April 1935, the Indian revolutionary MPT Acharya returned to Bombay after more than 26 years in exile. 2 days after his arrival, he gave an interview to the Bombay Chronicle, a newspaper that he had been the Berlin correspondent for since the late 1920s. The article read, I quote here, Mr. MPT Acharya, who left India nearly 26 years ago and had spent his life in various parts of the world, returned to India on Monday. On the continent, Mr. Acharya distinguished himself as a linguist and is thoroughly conversant with several continental languages and has also mastered the North European languages. In his peregrinations, Acharya has had intimate glimpses of the customs and manners of almost all peoples in the world. Mr. Acharya thinks that the Spanish in their temperament, outlook, and ideas resemble the Indian somewhat closely. Mr. Acharya proposes to stay in Bombay for some time, unquote. I should mention already here that Acharya did not spend any time in Spain. He had wanted to go to Spain before returning to India, but the Spanish Civil War was about to break out, and it was safer for him to travel back to India. He left his wife, the Russian painter Magda Nachman, behind with her sister in Switzerland for fears that he would be arrested upon arrival in India, and then she would be left alone. However, Acharya was left alone when he arrived in India, as the British authorities had promised him, and his wife Nachman joined him in Bombay in 1936. Throughout the next 20 years, until his death in March 1954, Acharya became India's most prominent anarchist theoretician and activist, trying to establish an anarchist movement and setting up an anarchist periodical in India, writing extensively for international anarchist publications, and carrying on correspondence with anarchists across the world, from Australia to Canada, from Uruguay to Mexico, the United States, Sweden, France, Germany, England, Spain, Japan, Korea, China, and of course within India. In other words, Acharya was a well-known figure within the international anarchist movement in the first half of the 20th century. But his contributions to anarchist history, his life and activities have almost been forgotten today. So as Suki already mentioned, in my biography, Anarchy or Chaos, MPT Acharya and the Indian Struggle for Freedom, which came out with Hearst Publishers in Europe last year, and then Penguin India in India last year as well, I trace Acharya's life and revolutionary travels across several decades, across several continents, across his militant anti-colonial activities to his anarchist pacifist ideas. And in my talk today, I'll try to give you a sense of this fascinating story of MPT Acharya's revolutionary travels. I'll now try and share a story map. So if you can, and as I go through this map that takes us all over the world, there's some photos accompanying the story. I'll try and say a few things about the photos as well. I hope you can see this photo. It's a massive, it's a view of the delegates who attended the Second Congress of the Communist International in July and August 1920 in Petrograd and Moscow in Russia. And the Indian delegates are sitting here. I don't know if you can see. But I think I'll show another photo later where you can see them more closely. So MPT Acharya was born in 1887 in the old neighborhood of Triplicane in Madras in India, and he attended the Hindu high school where Srinivasa Sastry was headmaster at the time. And he actually became involved in nationalist politics at an early age. Already in 1906, he was editor of a nationalist paper called the Bharat. And in 1907, already at the age of 20, at the age of 20, he became editor of a paper called India, which he moved to the French enclave of Pondicherry nearby in 1908 for fears of British repression of the journal. But he was so worried about being arrested that in late 1908, he fled India and arrived in Marseille in France, proceeding immediately to Paris, where I met Shyamji Krishnavarma, a prominent Indian nationalist, funder of many Indian anti-colonial revolutionary activities. And after spending about a week in Paris, he went to London. In London, he arrived in November 1908 and immediately went to India House, which was sort of it was a hostel for Indian students in London, but it was also a hub for militant Indian nationalists, where he was taken in to work as a cook, and then he received free lodging and boarding. And he soon became part of the sort of the inner circle of militant nationalists that included Vinayak Savarkar, V.V.S. Iyer, Rabindranath Chattopadhyaya, known as Chatto, and Lala Hardayal. And he helped translate Savarkar's famous historical treatise, The Indian War of Independence of 1857. But after the former India House resident Madanlal Dhingra assassinated British politician William Hutchinson Wiley on the front steps of the Imperial Institute in Kensington in London in July 1909, the militant Indian nationalists in London came under great surveillance and threat by the police, and Acharya sort of decided to flee again in August 1909. The photo you see here is a group photo from April 1909, and Acharya can be seen standing here, second from left. The man sitting here is Vinayak Savarkar. The young man here is Niranjan Pal, was Bipin Chandra Pal's son. The man sitting here on the far right was Govind Amin, who was a fairly close friend of Acharya. So Acharya spent about 9 months in London, becoming involved in the inner circles of India House before he decided to flee again. And so in August 1909, he went and got a British passport at the India office in London, and with a friend left Britain, destined for Morocco, where he wanted to join a local tribe called the Rifts in their struggle against Spanish colonial invaders. So it was sort of an act of anti-colonial solidarity. They were armed with rifles that were immediately confiscated when they arrived in Gibraltar. His friend went back to London. Acharya continued on to Tangiers, where he was stranded, soon realizing he had no money and the mission had failed. So he returned to Lisbon, where his friend Joaquim de Seguirea Coutinho, whom he knew from India House in London, had since moved. So he now lodged with him in Lisbon. In the meantime, what he didn't know was that an warrant for his arrest had been issued in India for publishing sedition in the paper called India that he helped bring out a year earlier. So he could not return to British soil again, and instead, a couple of months later, in October 1909, returned to Paris. The image you see here is the passenger list for the ship that he sailed when he left Britain, and these two little lines here mark the colonial passengers, Acharya and Sukhsagar Dutt, and they're listed as Indian students, the only colonial passengers on this particular ship here. So October 1909, Acharya has moved from Paris to London, London to Tangiers to Lisbon, and now he's in Brussels, October 1909. And he soon found lodging and work with S.R. Rana, who was also a prominent Indian nationalist, mostly operating in the background, financing a lot of revolutionary activities. He was a pearl merchant, slightly older than many of the sort of younger militant revolutionaries. He was a pearl merchant. There were lots of Indian pearl merchants in Paris at the time. So Acharya started, he lived with him and he started working for Rana as a secretary. And then also soon became involved in arms and bomb smuggling, as well as then assisting Madame Karma, who's again a well-known Indian revolutionary who lived in Paris at the time. So he assisted Madame Karma and Lala Hardayal, another well-known Indian revolutionary at the time, with the publication of their new periodical Bande Mataram. And in Paris, Acharya and many of the Indian nationalists associated close with particularly Egyptian nationalists also in exile. And in September 1910, Acharya, Lala Hardayal, Madame Karma, Chatto, his old friend Chatto from London, who had also moved to Paris at the time, as well as Asif Ali, they attended the Egyptian National Congress held in Brussels. It was initially supposed to be held in Paris, but the British protested to the French police, who insisted that they could not hold it in Paris, so they had to move it to Brussels. And Acharya at that Congress really became close friends with the Egyptian nationalist Mansour Rifat, which was a friendship that lasted several decades on. It's just to sort of indicate that there were fairly big anti-colonial congresses early on in Europe that drew in Egyptians, Indians, Persians, and various European socialists, communists, and whatnot. After the Congress in Brussels, Acharya went to Berlin for the first time in November 1910 to actually replace another Indian who tried to set up a new a nationalist group there, but failed to do so. Acharya went to Berlin and worked as a tea salesman for a tea company. He failed to set up a new nationalist group there, and he moved to Munich in April 1911, found work with another tea company, and then in Munich started associating with a staunch anti-imperialist named Walter Strickland, known as the Anarchist Baron. He was came from an aristocratic family, but he sort of disowned his family, but had lots of money, and he financed lots of anti-colonial, anti-imperial revolutionaries, as well as a couple of other Indians who were students at the university in Munich. But he spent about 6 months in Munich, and he was tired of his life there. The tea company he worked for had gone bankrupt. And he obtained letters of introduction from Walter Strickland, as well as Ajit Singh, who was another well-known Indian revolutionary who had gone into exile. And he proceeded to Istanbul in November 1911. So now he's been in exile for about 3 years, and he's already traveled across much of Europe. And now he's arriving in Istanbul, Constantinople, as it was known at the time. The Italian-Turkish war had just broke out, and Acharya hoped to sort of stir up anti-European feelings and solidarity between India's Muslims and the Young Turks. They were known as Young Turks in what was the Committee of Union and Progress. He met several prominent Turkish nationalists, hoping to get their support, but it was dismissed because they were too busy actually with the Italian war. He did a little bit of work on a newspaper and taught English at a school, but led a fairly sort of quiet life, which also meant that the British police, who were the British surveillance agency that were keeping him under close surveillance, lost track of him. And so in July 1912, Acharya actually fled again. This time he went to the US. He boarded a Greek ship traveling under Persian nationality and arrived in New York in July 1912. In New York, he reconnected with Chandrakanta Chakravarti, who he knew from India House in London, as well as the Irish revolutionary George Freeman, and he found lodging in the Upper East Side. He soon left New York and headed upstate to Plattsburgh, where he worked on a farm. He wanted to become a farm laborer, but it didn't take long for Acharya to return to New York, and he applied for U.S. citizenship which was actually rejected. Back in New York, he joined the Hindustan Association of America, which was a student association, fairly sort of liberal and not particularly revolutionary. But on the West Coast, obviously, his old friend Lala Hadayal had established the Gada Party in 1913. And by 1914, Acharya joined that, becoming a representative sort of on the East Coast. He proofread issues of the Gada publication, contributed to the paper. And it was also in New York that Acharya first met prominent anarchists, Alexander Berkman and Hippolyte Havel. They were editors of a prominent anarchist newspaper in the US at the time. Although Acharya admitted later on that he did not have a serious interest in anarchism at the time. The photo you see here is of MPT Acharya in New York, probably from 1912, 13 or 14. It was found in the FBI files. So the FBI, or what was later known as the FBI, was the Bureau of Intelligence at the time. They kept a file on MPT Acharya and many other Indians who were in the US at the time. So that takes us to 1914. And the First World War broke out in August 1914. Acharya's old friend Chatto had moved to Germany at the time and formed the Indian Independence Committee in Berlin with the assistance of the British Foreign Office, the German Foreign Office, with the hope of overthrowing the British in India, actually, with German assistance. Chatto soon called in his old friends from all over the world, including Acharya and Lala Hadayal. There were many others who joined from all over Europe and all over the US. They came to Berlin to take part in this German-funded attempt to overthrow the British in India. They planned to instigate a revolution in India through Afghanistan. They were hoping to turn soldiers who came in to fight in European theaters of war into revolutionaries. They wanted them to defect and join their cause instead. They went into prisoner of war camps to recruit prisoners to their cause. They learned to manufacture hand grenades, among other things. And then when the Ottoman Empire, when Turkey entered the war on the side of the Germans, what was known as the Indian-German conspiracy really became a global battlefield. What you see here is the well-known Indian revolutionary Lala Hadayal's fake passport. As I think I've already mentioned now, Acharya also traveled under fake passports when he first went to the US for the first time. Now, Acharya was also issued a fake passport, which I haven't found, but just to give you an example of what they looked like. So in 1915, in collaboration with the Germans, the Indian Independence Committee planned missions across the world. They were smuggling weapons from the United States via Indonesia into India. They're plotting an invasion of India via Afghanistan, and they carried out sabotage and battles across the Middle East. And Acharya relocated to Istanbul in March 1915 and joined various daring missions to Damascus, Jerusalem, Beersheba, Baghdad, and the Suez Canal, where his mission actually, in collaboration with some local Bedouins, Egyptian Bedouins, blew up a British railway. But many of these missions were plagued by internal disagreements and, to be honest, incompetence. And the Indian Independence Committee had to close their mission in Istanbul in March 1917, which was a task that Acharya was responsible for. And that included packing up revolvers, arms, guns, sending them back to Berlin, paying rent, getting rid of furniture, and all these things, practical stuff. Acharya was responsible for that. So now it's March 1917, and Acharya is back in Berlin. A couple of months later, he and Chatto left Berlin for Stockholm in Sweden, where they wanted to agitate for Indian independence amongst the Second International Socialists, so mostly social democrats, but also communists and various other shades of socialists had gathered for a sort of a socialist peace congress. There were negotiations amongst many of these socialists throughout the next year and a half. And they, Chatto and Acharya, set up the Indian National Committee, and they started publishing articles about British tyranny in India in Scandinavian newspapers. They allied themselves with other colonial and subject peoples in the cities, and such as the Finnish, the Ukrainians, the Polish, the Egyptians, the Persians, and they met various prominent European socialist leaders. They really wanted to bring the question of Indian independence into the potential peace questions and settling the borders after the First World War. But they really failed to get a proper hearing. The European socialists did not care about the colonial problem, and they dismissed them as not being proper socialists. They were Indian nationalists. Instead, Acharya and Chatto attended the Third Civil War Conference, was sort of a fraction within the Socialist International that agitated for peace, which included Lenin and Trotsky, amongst others. And it brought them closer to many Russian revolutionaries and the Bolshevik promises of self-determination. So when the war ended in November 1918, the committee closed down in Stockholm, and Acharya returned to Berlin, where he actually briefly met Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the famous German communists, before he proceeded to Bern in Switzerland to attend another socialist congress. And nothing really came off these ventures. And by April 1919, he was back in Berlin. As far as I know, he's the only Indian to have met Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but maybe others can correct me on that. So by April 1919, he's back in Berlin. About a month later, the Indians in Berlin held a meeting at which it was decided that a mission should travel to Moscow to meet Lenin. And Acharya joined Mahendra Pratap and Abdul Rab, two sort of well-known Indians that he knew from Istanbul, on a fairly dangerous journey to Moscow. They traveled through the war-torn Baltic states. There were rumors that Acharya had been shot to death along the way, but he wasn't. But the delegation made it to Moscow in July 1919, and he met Lenin and Muhammad Barkatullah, who was a veteran Indian Muslim revolutionary who had set up a provisional government of India in Kabul in Afghanistan with Mahendra Pratap during the war. At the meeting with Lenin, it was decided that the Indian delegation should go to Afghanistan with Yakov Seward, who was the first Russian ambassador to Afghanistan, as well as his secretary Igor Reisner, to meet the Emir of Afghanistan and ask for help against the British in India. And Acharya became fairly good friends with Suritz and Igor Reisner as well. So now we're sort of July, September, August, September 1919, and it's been decided that Acharya should travel to Kabul to meet the Emir. They left Moscow in September 1919 and traveled through Central Asia and arrived in Kabul in late December 1919, where Acharya and Abdul Rab broke with Mahendra Pratap, who was he was an Indian prince of a fairly small Indian principality. But Acharya and Rab broke with him and formed the Indian Revolutionary Association, which was a fairly revolutionary body that had a propaganda section and an active section that aimed to carry out guerrilla warfare, and Acharya belonged to that. It also embraced many of the ideas of the Bolsheviks, but was not attached or affiliated with the Communist International yet. But as a delegate of the Indian Revolutionary Association, Acharya attended the Second Congress of the Communist International held in Petrograd and Moscow in July and August 1920. He traveled with Mohammad Shafiq, who was part of Barkatullah's provisional government, and he first met Abani Mukherjee and M.N. Roy in Petrograd. And at the Second Congress, the four Indians joined forces to address issues of colonialism, indentured labor, and pan-Islamism to Lenin and the Communist International. And while Acharya had actually initially been proposed as a member of the commission, it's been a fairly well-known commission on the national and colonial question. It was M.N. Roy who joined that and caught the attention of Lenin and really emerged as the most prominent Indian delegate. The photo here is from the Second Congress of the Communist International. The four Indians are sitting here. So the first is Abani Mukherjee, that's MPT Acharya. This is Evelyn Trent, who's M.N. Roy's wife. And this is Mohammad Shafiq. M.N. Roy and Evelyn Trent represented the Mexican Communist Party and were not Indian delegates per se. And Abani Mukherjee had come via Indonesia, I think, and was actually listed as the only Indian communist, even though he wasn't. So they went to the Second Congress of the Communist International in July-August 1920, representing sort of four different strands of Indian revolutionary groups in Russia at the time. And shortly after, they traveled to Tashkent in Uzbekistan and founded the Indian Communist Party on the 17th of October, 1920. Acharya remained a member of the Indian Revolutionary Association that he had founded only 10 months earlier. But he was really instrumental in the formative months of the Indian Communist Party, and he led various missions to Andijan and Bukhara and recruited new members into the party. But by and by, in December, M.N. Roy's grip on the party and Acharya's continued membership of the Indian Revolutionary Association became a contentious issue. And only 2 months after the formation of the Indian Communist Party, the Indians discussed Acharya's allegiance to the Bolsheviks. Was he actually a communist? Was he allowed to be a member of the Indian Revolutionary Party Association, while he was also a member of the Indian Communist Party? M.N. Roy believed that Acharya could not be a member of both, and Acharya was formally expelled from the Indian Communist Party at a meeting on the 28th of December 1920. So to resolve the differences between the various Indian revolutionary groups in Russia, Acharya and Roy traveled to Moscow, and they stayed at the Hotel Lux, which is a fascinating hotel with a history of its own, to discuss the differences with the Communist International. In the meantime, his old friend Chatto and a group of Indians from Berlin arrived in Moscow to propose an alternative to M.N. Roy's communist group. But by then, Roy had really captivated Lenin and the Bolsheviks, and Chatto and Acharya lost out, basically, to the dominating Roy. Throughout the next year and a half, Acharya stayed in Moscow. He started living as a journalist. He worked for also the American Relief Administration. And he met and married the Russian artist Magda Nachman at some point in 1921 or 22, we don't know. He had by then met several now forgotten Russian anarchists and had really turned to anarchism rather than communism. And so by November 1922, Acharya's presence in Moscow was no longer tolerated. He was considered a counter-revolutionary because he was an anarchist by the time. And he had to flee another oppressive regime in November 1922. So in mid-November 1922, Acharya and his new wife Nachman escaped Russia and arrived in Berlin. He actually went to live where he had lived briefly during the Second World War. He probably didn't know where else to go, so he returned to the same address where he had lived in 1914. A few weeks later, Acharya attended the founding meeting of the anarcho-syndicalist International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, and really threw himself into anarchist agitation in India. He set up a committee with the explicit aim of sending anarchist material to Indian papers to affiliate Indian labor movements with the IWMA. And he wrote extensively about anarchism for Indian papers such as Forward, The People, and the Bombay Chronicle. While at the same time, he also wrote about India and colonialism for anarchist papers such as Der Syndikalist and the IWMA press service. There was a French paper, Lund University, and La Protesta, which was a paper in Brazil, I believe. In 1927, he broke with his old friend Chatto, who by then had turned to communism and the League Against Imperialism, which Acharya was a member of briefly in the beginning, but because of its affiliation with the Communist International and Acharya being an anarchist, he refused to work with Chatto and the League Against Imperialism any longer. Instead, he joined the International Anti-Militarist Bureau, which was an anarchist organization, and the International Anti-Militarist Commission, which was also an anarchist, anti-militarist, pacifist organization. And he really started engaging with Gandhi's civil disobedience campaign then underway in India. And he wrote extensively for various anarchist papers about Gandhi. He was ambivalent. He hated the cult and myth around Gandhi, but actually praised a lot of Gandhi's activities, particularly the Salt March in 1930. So that takes us to the early 1930s, and the political climate in Berlin is changing rapidly. Nazism is on the rise, and Germany simply became too dangerous for many of the Indian anti-colonial activists, including Acharya, who were in Berlin at the time. In 1933, several of his friends were arrested by the Nazis and expelled. And Acharya was trying to return to India, but because there was an arrest warrant out on him since 1909, a warrant that had been renewed in 1925, Acharya was not promised amnesty if he was going to return to India. So he was afraid of getting arrested. So it took many years before he actually actually summoned the courage to return to India. I'm just going to try. Yeah. So they managed to flee Berlin in January 1934 with the help of Subhash Chandra Bose, who Acharya met in Berlin in 1933, as well as some Chinese revolutionaries whom Acharya was friends with in Berlin. They escaped Germany and arrived in Zurich, where they stayed with Magda Nachman, so Acharya's wife's sister. And throughout the next year, they lived sort of underground between Zurich and Paris. And Acharya actually met Madame Karma again after more than 20 years of not seeing her. And he met some fairly prominent French anarchists, including E. Armand, with whom he carried out extensive correspondence over 30 years or so. But in March 1935, the British finally granted Acharya amnesty for his revolutionary activities and permitted him to return to India on condition that he refrained from political activities. And in late March, he'd saved enough money to afford a ticket for India and set off from the Italian port city of Genoa. So in April 1935, Acharya arrived in Bombay and he left his wife Nachman behind with a sister for about a year. He settled at Ridge Road in Mumbai, but he quite quickly felt lonely and isolated. His wife arrived sometime in 1936, but he started writing up his memoirs, as well as several sort of biographical essays on Madame Karma, Savarkar, Walter Strickland, and Chatto. And he remained in touch with anarchists across the world and wrote about the Spanish Civil War from an Indian perspective. So in doing so, he connected sort of the global resistances against fascism and colonialism, and tried to also build up an anarchist movement in India with Ranchola's Baron Ludwala, whom he had met briefly in Berlin and had also returned to Mumbai at the time, as well as the Indian Institute of Sociology in Bombay. Ludwala, through Acharya's connections, started writing to all the well-known anarchists around the world and started importing and translating anarchist texts into English, from German into English, amongst other things, and reprinting them in the Indian Sociologist, which was the paper of the Indian Institute of Sociology. Towards the end of the 1930s, Acharya was well aware that war was about to break out, and he wrote several really insightful essays on the rise of fascism and war in some of the Indian newspapers that he wrote for at the time. When the war broke out, he was simply cut off from the international anarchist movement. And to be honest, I don't know what Acharya did during the Second World War. After the war, he said that he had not worked since 1939. So I assume he did not do much during the war. At this point, he's also getting older, obviously, and he's into his 50s, and he struggled with health issues for about 30 years. At some point during the Second World War, Acharya and Nachman moved to Balkeshwar Road, and from there, shortly after the war ended, Acharya started reaching out to old friends such as Iyaman, the French anarchist, Augustin Souchy, who was a prominent German anarchist whom he met in Berlin, who lived in Mexico at the time. He wrote to Karl Korsch, who was a famous sort of left-wing communist who lived in the US at the time. He wrote to Ruth Fischer, another famous German left-wing communist who also lived in the US, as well as to Helmut Rüdiger, a German anarchist who lived in Sweden at the time. And he connected with anarchists that he had not known, but just to connect with anarchists all over the world, including Boris Zelensky, who was a Russian anarchist who lived in Chicago in the US. He wrote extensively with Taiji Yamaga, who was a really famous Japanese anarchist, as well as the Chinese anarchist Li Pei Kan. In collaboration with Ludwala, he started importing anarchist literature for their now called the Libertarian Socialist Institute in Bombay, which was a specifically anarchist organization. He wrote extensively for global anarchist periodicals, as well as for Indian papers such as the Kaise Hind and Haijan. He wrote almost weekly for these two papers about sort of anarchism. He wrote anarchistically, as he said. These were the only papers that allowed him to write. He said the communist papers would not publish any of his anarchist ideas. He broke with Ludwala, who became more of an individualist anarchist, where Acharya was a communist anarchist, and instead with his friend Dian Vanchu, who was the son of one of his friends, he tried to set up an anarchist periodical in Bombay. They reached out to many anarchists across the world and asked for material for this particular paper. And they probably received lots of material as well, but the paper never materialized. They simply didn't have the money and the funding to do it. The two of them, however, represented India in what was known as the Commission for International Anarchist Relations, which was sort of an attempt to reunite the fractured international anarchist movement after the Second World War. And Acharya and Vanchu were the Indian representatives here. His wife, Nachman, died in February 1951, which really dealt an incredible blow to Acharya. He struggled to do anything for weeks and months after, but started reaching out to his friends and asked for help. but really he suffered from extremely poor health. He had suffered from tuberculosis since late 1948. And then by 1954, he died in March 1954. He went to the Bhatia hospital in Mumbai, where he died on the 20th of March. With him, I also believe the anarchist movement really died in India. I think that's what I wanted to say about the sort of the story that I'm telling in the book. But I would like to say maybe a few more things. If I can, let me just try and share another screen here. So on my website, I've created a list. I've uploaded a list of all the works by MPT Acharya that I've found. So they're available for download. There's more than 200 here in various languages. So if any of you are ever interested in reading what he actually wrote, you can just go to my website and download it and read it. Okay, I think that should be it for me, but I hope we have time for questions, and I hope you enjoyed what I had to say about MPT Acharya. Thank you.
We did. Thank you so much, Dr. Laursen. That was an absolutely fascinating account. I'd like to thank you for such a lucid presentation, because your story map literally took us along his life and the places that he went to. It's a brilliant way of, a very simple and lucid way of sharing. Thank you so much for that. But before I even dive into the questions, I have a question. Could you tell us how you came about choosing the life of of MPT Acharya?
Yeah, so I actually I'm writing another book, and this book on MPT got in the way and was much more interesting. But I'm working on another book on the Indian Revolution movement in Europe from 1905 to 1918. That's sort of a shorter period, but a much broader history of various Indian revolutionaries that were in Europe at the time, in Britain, France, Switzerland, Germany, and Sweden, Turkey, the Netherlands. And Acharya was one of these figures who traveled from France to Britain, back to France, to Switzerland, to Germany, to Sweden. Chatter was another figure who traveled across many of these countries. Lala Hadayal, Madame Kama, Shamji Krishnavama, all these figures traveled across many of these countries. I became fascinated by Acharya because of his turn to anarchism. I had read hints here and there that he was actually one of the few Indians who actually embraced anarchism as political philosophy. And I wanted to see how much of an anarchist he actually was. As I started digging into it, I found a huge body of writing that as the more I looked, the more I found in many different languages. He published in anarchist periodicals in English, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Italian, Japanese, Chinese, Yiddish. So I realized there was an incredibly fascinating story here of someone who was actually deeply embedded in the international anarchist movement at the time, and then also centered in some of the really interesting sort of places, such as in Moscow, in Berlin, in Bombay, and so to tell that story out of these venues was incredibly fascinating. So while I was writing that other book, this book became more interesting, and now I'm going back to writing the other book again.
We are glad that you found that and you could write this book. But I have another question again before I go on to the others. You know, in today's time, the entire idea of anarchy is very different from what it would have been 100 years ago or 150 years ago. So could you put that into perspective for us?
I mean, yeah, so you're right. It was, in many ways, a completely different world, obviously, although there are many similarities with what is going on today. But at the time that Acharya turned to anarchism, and I mean philosophical, ideological, political anarchism here, not this idea actually of chaos and terrorism. Um, by the time Acharya turned to anarchism, let's say when he came to Berlin in November 1922, he'd come out of a world of the First World War, extreme chaos. He had seen the rise of Bolshevism as another fascist ideology. He had negotiated with European socialists, social democrats of various shades, and found um, all of those political ideologies failing, failing to actually talk about freedom in any meaningful sense. That could only come when you abandon the idea of the nation state that governed people. He wanted the people to free themselves. He wanted people to govern themselves. When in the 1920s, when he sort of lives in Berlin and becomes more and more entangled into anarchism, obviously that is a time when fascism is on the rise. He sees it in Italy, he sees it in Spain, he sees Nazism on the rise in Germany, he sees Bolshevism, Stalinism on the rise in Russia. There are economic upheavals, the Great Depression. All of these, to Acharya, are chaos that come out of capitalism, imperialism, and fascism. The only answer for him is anarchism. I think there are similarities with what is going on today. He would most likely look at this world and say, this is climate change, this is chaos, there's war everywhere, this is chaos, there's religious upheavals, this is chaos. The only way forward is anarchy and pacifist anarchy.
And history can repeat itself, and
Yeah.
come back to that. What's amazing is how much, how young many of these people were, not just MPT, but the others who, not just people that he met here, but people outside. I mean, today at 25, people are still figuring out, what to do with their lives. But a lot of these people, sort of got driven by passion, which was much bigger than just themselves. Again, is that a reflection of the times then?
I think so. I think we're talking about a particular generation that was born around 1890, 1885 to 1890. Uh, Lots of them, Chatter was slightly older, but not a lot. Hadayal was slightly older, but not a lot. And they became involved also in the early 20s. Emin Roy was the exact same age as Acharya. I think it's a reflection of the time. Many of them are students who travel abroad. Acharya was he didn't travel abroad to get a university degree, but he mingled with students, and they become radicalized, in particular when they go abroad and sort of travel in these student environments that are quite revolutionary at the time. So they are incredibly young. Like I said, Acharya became involved when he was 18, 19, and has to flee when he's 21. It's quite remarkable, I think.
Yeah. And the ease with which he traveled. I mean, he's not only traveling across continents. I mean, I'm thinking even today it makes me tired just thinking of it. But in those days on ships, and then also on documents that they were getting created. I think that was just amazing.
Yeah, I'm quite fascinated by that. I've been interested in this aspect of how did you actually travel? How could you travel? I mean, the idea of passports really only became sort of standardized internationally in the 1920s, I think. So before that, there was no sort of international standard for how a passport should look. And when he first left India, I don't think he didn't have a passport. He was traveling within, I think, the British Empire. And only when he left he wanted to go to North Africa, to Morocco. He needed a passport for that, and I found his passport in the FBI files. So he traveled on a passport then, and then, as I said, when he fled Istanbul, he somehow managed to obtain a fake Persian passport. When he traveled from the US back to Germany when the First World War broke out, he got a Persian passport again from the German authorities in the US. He traveled under German East African nationality during the war. When he went to Russia and came back to Berlin, he traveled on a Russian passport. And then when he had to go back to India, he had to get a British passport again. And that's when it became problematic for him to travel, and he had to explain what had happened to his previous passport. And I mean, he lied basically, but eventually he managed to get a passport to travel back to India.
Fascinating. Taranjot Singh has a question for you. That when Acharya was forced to flee Moscow in 1922, was it only because of his anarchist views, or is it possible that there was some prejudice against his interracial marriage among the Bolsheviks?
I don't think there was any prejudice against sort of his marriage. That does not seem to have been the issue at all. It was specifically because of him not being a member of the Indian Communist Party anymore. He and 5 other Indians had been expelled at the time, and by then they were considered counter-revolutionaries, and they could not be let loose to travel freely because there was fears by the Bolsheviks that they would spread anti-Bolshevik propaganda. So they were actually not allowed to cross out of Russia. But somehow, and Acharya doesn't explain how, he just says, somehow, miraculously, I managed to escape. Yeah, it's a fascinating story, though, and apparently the border guards between Russia and Germany at the time had been instructed not to let him pass, and he says, no, I managed to somehow.
His being multilingual might have also helped him. Milind has a question. He's first of all, he says it's a fascinating account, and wonder what kept people like him motivated to pursue such a difficult life. It could not have been easy, you know, cross country travel and staying in places and with no known income sources. So that part of life must have been tough for him.
Absolutely. I mean, I try to convey this in my book as well. It is not a romantic journey into exile. It is hardship and starvation and not knowing what to do next. And Acharya is not, he doesn't come from a well-off family. He doesn't have a lot of money. There's a lot of uncertainty, and he writes about this in some of his letters every now and then, that he doesn't know what to do. What motivated him was the thought of freedom and independence. Those are the sort of only recurring ideas that really run through his life. The idea of independence and freedom. And gradually, independence from the British Empire is not the same as freedom anymore. Because after, obviously, India gains independence in 1947, for Acharya, the Indians are not free. They're still governed by then, native rulers of various kinds, capitalists. So it is that pursuit of freedom that really guides Acharya's activities.
That should also answer Millen's next question, where he says, why is he called anarchist when all along he stood against colonial rule and later fascism? And how did this transformation come about?
So he's called he embraced anarchist ideologies himself. He called himself an anarchist. And again, by anarchism, I don't mean this chaotic terrorist idea, which is a sort of derogatory term. It is anarchism in the idea of anti-statism, anti-capitalism, anti-fascism. Um, so that is sort of his political ideology. He combines that with anticolonialism and anti-fascism. He speaks up against colonialism using anarchist arguments. He speaks up against fascism using anti-colonial anarchist arguments. The transformation seems to have come about from sort of from a nationalist anti-colonial revolutionary to an anarchist anti-colonial revolutionary during his time in Russia, where he sort of encountered various Russian anarchists and also saw the sort of oppressive regime of the Bolsheviks, and could see, that was just another foreign totalitarian regime, basically. I hope that answers the question.
I hope it does. Milind also says, when he came to Bombay, did he not contact Savarkar, who had already settled down in Bombay? So is there a record of them getting in touch again?
To the best of my knowledge, no. There's no record of them having direct contact. I think in 1937, I think Acharya published, as I mentioned, he started publishing these biographical essays about Savarkar and Chertow and Madame Karma. So he wrote an essay about Savarkar, and he actually praised Savarkar quite a lot. He admired his revolutionary activities. I don't know how much he knew about Savarkar's political ideology at the time. Later on, in 1940, I can't remember if before or after Gandhi's been assassinated, but Acharya revises his position and criticizes Savarkar a lot and says he has not developed his mind since 1924. And so but he still sort of admired Savarkar for his activities and his sacrifice, as he saw it. But he did not admire his ideology in any way.
Sabira Fernandez says, wow, he's a polyglot too. And how was his interaction with Gandhi, or was that before?
So in the 1920s, he started writing, engaging with Gandhi's ideas. He was in Berlin at the time, and obviously many of the Indians who were in Berlin. There were about 200 Indians in Berlin. Nehru came as well, and many Indians who went to London also went to Berlin to visit. So they got information about what was going on in India. He started engaging quite a lot with Gandhi's nonviolence campaign, and as I mentioned, particularly the Salt March was in Acharya's eyes a master lesson in anarchism, because he went against the government, he went against the British, and it was a mass revolution without any leaders per se. He made the masses go against the colonial rule. But he despised the myth and the around Gandhi. He did not like that cult that was around Gandhi, the following. When Acharya tried to return to India in the 1920s already, he wanted to return. He asked Nehru for help. He asked Sastry for help. And he also wrote to Gandhi for help. But Gandhi did not respond to Acharya. And so Acharya was actually really furious on a personal level with Gandhi for not helping him. But he kept sort of engaging with Gandhi's thoughts and what was going on, even into the 1940s. And then after Gandhi's assassinated, I think Acharya revises his position a bit on Gandhism. He becomes involved extensively with Vinoba Bhave and the whole movement around the Haijan journal, and he actually calls them near-anarchists. To him, these are the sort of most close to anarchism in India at the time. And I think in 1952 or 53, Acharya writes in Haijan extensively about the Vinoba Bhave's movement, and actually says this is true anarchism. This is not the kind of European version of anarchism. This is true anarchism. So he embraces that within the sort of broader anarchist tradition, if you will. So it's a long engagement with Gandhi and Gandhism and sort of Gandhi's tactics throughout his life. Yeah.
Uh, I absolutely echo what Sabira Fernandez says. Why haven't we taught about these people who are on the fringes of independence and worked tirelessly? I think that we're a young democracy and we need to learn about a lot more people who participated and not just the few that we've read in our history books. And therefore, we are so grateful for people like you who are bringing them out of with all the research that you're doing and all the documents that you're pulling out and putting together. But there is a question here still. Why was he expelled from the Congress?
Congress. And I'm not sure what you mean by the Congress, the Indian National Congress?
Indian National Congress.
Acharya was never part of the Indian National Congress.
Okay.
He did not want to be part of, because
Anyway.
that was a state-like structure. They wanted a national state. He did not want that at all. He actually had a falling out with Nehru in Berlin in 1928, and because Nehru had gone to Moscow and been given a tour of some of the Russian prisons and seen how great prisoners were treated in Russian prisons, and came back to Berlin and told the Indians in Berlin, "Oh, look how great it is in Russia." And Chavez said, "No, no, no. You were only shown a certain side of the Bolshevik prisons." And they clashed a bit. They wrote extensively in a paper called The People that came out of Lahore. So anyway, just to say, he also fell out with many people, and but I think later on in life he reconciled with Nehru, and Nehru actually sent him some money towards the end of Acharya's life to basically survive.
It's fabulous that there has been so much written correspondence between people, which we can fall back on research. I'm not sure how much of emails will survive from the present times for future folks to research. Sabira also says, "Wow, it's amazing that even FBI kept tabs on him, and some of us are just barely hearing about him." This was an absolutely delightfully presented and awe-inspiring session about someone that we need to know more. More people must know about him. I hope more people buy your book. And of course, all the best for the next book that you're coming up with, because that will have even more interesting range of people that you are going to be talking about. So all the best for that. Thank you very much for this talk. And thank you to everyone else for joining us today and all those who will watch this on YouTube later. Thank you very much. Enjoy your Saturday and see you all next week.
Thank you.